Hey, it's Mrs. Gatrell here with another Gatrell interpretation about AP Biology Ecology Unit. So, let's start out talking a little bit about behavior. Animal behavior was studied a lot by a guy named Nico Tenenberg. He had several questions that he wanted to answer, but two of them were the how and the why. How are animals performing a particular response to a stimuli? What are the anatomical and physiological mechanisms that are occurring? He called this proximate causation, the how behind why an animal initiates a certain response. These are controlled by genes. He also talked about ultimate causation, which was the why. Why ultimately is this an adaptive advantage to have this behavior? And why is it evolutionarily significant? So let's go on to talk about a few of behaviors that we find in animals. So kinesis is basically an undirected movement in response to a stimuli. If you turn on a light, a cockroach will scatter. Whereas taxis is a directed movement that is toward or away from a particular stimulus. For example, a plant growing to the light. Another type of taxis is a huge noticeable event in certain areas every year. And around here, I see it mostly in birds. But what is it? It's migration, of course. So how do the organisms know that it's time, and how do they know how to get from point A to point B? Well, there's a lot of different reasonings and thoughts on that. And some people believe that it is the sun that helps them to navigate. Some say it's the stars, and some say it's the Earth's gravitational field, or excuse me, magnetic field. So why? Why do the organisms just pick up and move? Well, this could be in response to light and dark cycles. It could also be in response to a dry season and a lack of food. A behavior that I find particularly fascinating is a type of communication that honeybees show called the waggle dance. And the waggle dance is able to show them the direction to fly in and how far away it is from the food source to the hive. So it this type of communication, or communication in general for animals, takes on a variety of forms. It can be visual, chemical, tactile, or auditory. So in the situation like the waggle dance, if you're in a completely dark hive, it's going to be a tactile and a chemical sense that you're getting. You're going to be able to chemically detect the pollen, and then you're going to feel the movement of the dance and the vibrations of the wings. But if it is in the light, it's going to have a more visual component. So let's talk about a couple other interesting behaviors. So one of my favorites is the male stickleback fish and their fixed action pattern. So a fixed action pattern is in response to some particular sign stimulus, and it is a very simple thing. In this fish, anything that is red that passes by them, they'll be met with an aggressive behavior from the male stickleback. We watched a little video of some objects that didn't even look anything like fish, and the stickleback attacking them. Another fixed action pattern, one of my favorites, even though it's sad, is a cuckoo. Because of the fact that cuckoos invest in brood parasitism, the cuckoo, when it hatches in the nest of its foster parents, it is going to push every object that it can out of that nest. And that is another type of an innate behavior called a fixed action pattern. Another innate behavior is imprinting. Imprinting occurs in a very sensitive period within an organism's lifetime. It is usually very early on. So birds also go through a type of learning during their sensitive period where they learn their song. Some experiments were done using whooping cranes because of the fact that they are endangered. Scientists have been trying to figure out ways to increase their populations. Well, they did raise some whooping cranes by hand. They imprinted on humans. And right here you see a human dressed in a crane outfit flying the plane to teach his babies how to fly. I love that one. Another type of behavior is actually a learning behavior referred to as spatial learning. So the digger wasp displays this behavior where it uses different landmarks to tell where an object is at. Like this experiment here where the pine cones were used for it to differentiate between where its nest is and where it's not. All you had to do is move the pine cones and you messed up this poor guy trying to figure things out. This is kind of like me giving somebody directions and I say, go down to the McDonald's at the corner and turn right. A lot of us do use this type of spatial learning. So let's see what's next. Associative learning. Associative learning is a really interesting type. This is one of my favorite examples where this blue jay here has eaten a monarch butterfly. It makes him sick. So then he starts to avoid anything that looks like that monarch butterfly. So this is associative learning. An interesting type of learning in this situation here is considered to be a type of social learning. Between the eastern and western garter snakes, the eastern garter snake, when presented with a banana slug, will have no idea what to do with that thing, doesn't even see it as a food source. Whereas a western garter snake has learned through generations that the banana slug is actually a viable food source. So obtaining food and having some social learning do sometimes go together. And here's a great example. Not only are they learning how to use tools, they're also learning how to forage for different types of food. And this is going to lead to a higher rate of survival and a higher reproductive success. If you teach each other how to obtain food, your whole group will be healthier. So we're going to change gears and talk a little bit about mating and mating systems. So mating systems and sexual dimorphism, here are the next couple slides. And we have three main ones here. We have sort of three, monogamous situation where you have one male and one female. And then you have a promiscuous situation, not shown here, a male and a female, but then they all change and they don't stick together. Then you have polygamous relationships where you have polyandry, which is one female and multiple males, and then polygyny, which is one male and multiple females. So why pick just one? Well, let's take a look. Sometimes organisms pair bond with their mate for a few different reasons. One of the main reasons is actually if they need to give a lot of parental care to their offspring. If they are going to pair bond, it is generally due to the production and the reception of a hormone called ADH, also called vasopressin. It's made in the hypothalamus, and in certain organisms that have a receptor for this, they are going to pair bond with each other to increase the likelihood of their children surviving and therefore making them more reproductively successful. Another chemical that can be released is oxytocin, generally released by females when their babies suckle, that causes the mother and the babies to bond. There is a genetic basis for behavior, and like I mentioned before, it depends on the expression, of a receptor gene that's products are going to bind with the different hormones that are released, the ADH or vasopressin. So our example was a male prairie vole. It does pair bond with its mates, but the male meadow voles do not. They don't even recognize that because that hormone, because they don't have the receptor for that. So let's continue talking a little bit about sexual selection and mate choice. Sexual dimorphism results from sexual selection, which is a type of natural selection. And that is when dimorphism means that they have two different body styles. You can see, it's a little hard to see, in the top left corner there, the male versus the female. When he turns around in that lower picture, you can see there's distinctively different color and patterns on him. If you look at the peacock on the right, they also are very, very beautiful and much more brightly colored to be able to attract mates. Well, that type of selection is intersexual selection, meaning between the sexes. So members of one sex are going to choose the other one based on certain characteristics that they find attractive. So intrasexual selection, of course, is within the same gender, and it involves competition between generally males for mates. The males will fight for a mate at an area where they'll go to show off and see who's the dominant male, and that area is referred to as a lek. So we were talking about offspring and talking about different mechanisms to help ensure that your offspring survive, like pair bonding to provide better care. But what if we can take it a step further? How about if we can get some of our relatives to help us with our offspring? Well, that's what we refer to when we talk about altruism. Altruism is also known as selflessness, and it is explained by a principle that they refer to as inclusive fitness. Inclusive fitness is the total effect an individual has on proliferating its genes by producing its own offspring and also by helping close relatives with producing or surviving the production of their offspring. So it's like kind of the helpful aunt that goes and watches over the children, makes sure that they're playing safely, and makes sure that they get enough to eat. And these guys are definitely a great example of altruistic organisms. So let's change gears, do a little refresh on general ecology. So what is ecology? Ecology is the study of interactions of organisms with other organisms and with their physical environment. Population. Population includes members of the same species that live in the same area, meaning that they can interbreed. A community. What's a community? It's all of the different populations in one area. An ecosystem. It's the community plus the non-living abiotic factors. So you're taking all of the different organisms living together and interacting with the land and the weather and all the abiotic factors. What's the biosphere? It is basically all of the area which supports life on Earth, meaning everything from the upper atmosphere, little microorganisms up there floating around, to the bottom of the deep ocean trenches where you're going to find some lovely thermoacidic files and some tube worms. So let's refresh on some types of ecosystems and some types of biomes. Now, to be completely honest, whatever textbook you look at, you're going to find a different list of biomes. And so I'm just going to go over the general ones here. We have our savanna grassland, our rainforest, our temperate forests, deserts, Arctic tundra, coniferous forest, and then if you talk about the aquatic biomes, you can have from like 7 to 14 different ones that people classify. We know that they consist of rivers, ponds, oceans, estuaries, wetlands, and they vary. But why do they vary? And if you look at this map, it's a very generalized maps of the biomes of the world. You are going to notice that they do have a slight sideways pattern, meaning that they are responding to latitude lines. So latitude and mountain ranges have significant impacts on where biomes are found. So just like moving away from the equator or up in latitude, you're going to get cooler and cooler and cooler. Moving up in altitude does the same thing. But why? Because of the sun's energy. As you are at the equator, you have the most direct and most intense sunlight, meaning the largest amount of energy per square kilometer. As you move further and further away from the equator, that same amount is spread over a larger and larger surface area. So you're spreading out your thermal energy. So besides latitude, mountain ranges can have a large impact on the environment. And this is a great visual diagram. So as you go up a mountain range, we're going to undergo some changes. But let me remind you of something. That uneven heating of the Earth's surface causes winds, as convection allows for air to heat up, expand, rise, get up into the atmosphere, cool down, condense, and fall. As it does this, it also picks up moisture from the area. So as the moist air moves in this picture from the left to right, you're going to see it try to go up, up, up a mountain range. As we go up, we know it gets cooler. The clouds will condense. They'll condense to the point where they cannot hold the precipitation any longer, and it will release all of the precipitation on one side of the mountain. By the time it gets over the mountain, it is so dry, it's not going to have any precipitation left. So here's a great picture. I love this one. You see the longitude is very close to each other. The latitude is the exact same. Elevation is almost the same. Let me move myself out of this frame for a second. And we have the mean annual precipitation on one side is 56 inches, and on the other side, it's only 8 inches. And that's going to show you how drastic the effects of a mountain range are. The windward side is the side the wind hits, the precipitation accumulates, and the leeward side is all the leftover, and unfortunately, there's not a lot of precipitation left with that. So let's see what's next. Several factors influence the distribution of organisms on Earth, and two of them we just kind of talked about. So the sun's energy being unevenly distributed across the globe, and the elevation of an area. Those are two of the factors that are going to affect global climates. We also talked about air patterns and mountain ranges. Of course, other abiotic factors are going to include minerals and nutrients within soil or water, precipitation, and salinities. Biotic factors also play a role in the distribution of organisms, and we're going to talk about these different types of relationships several times in the next couple minutes. So some of the biotic factors are predation, herbivory, competition, and symbiosis. And we'll get into each of those a little bit more in just a moment. So let's talk about keystone species. Keystone species is a species that helps to maintain biodiversity in an area. They often are top predators. This is referred to as a top-down model of the control of a community. And what they do is they tend to keep a natural ecosystem in balance, and they have a greater effect than other organisms within the ecosystem. Some really good keystone species are examples are right here, the sea otter, and another one is the sea star. So there's been experiments where they've taken sea stars out of an intertidal zone and watched as the biodiversity plummeted. Um, when they started with 14 or 15 organisms in that ecosystem, within a couple of years, it was down to 7 or 8. And then a few years after that, it was a monoculture. They just had only one type of organism, and that's not good. So let's talk a little bit about distribution of organisms in general. So the distribution or dispersion patterns of organisms can be uniform, they can be random, they can be clumped. Many of them are clumped. And I recently became aware of an interesting example of a uniform distribution occurring in a plant, which excreted a toxin, which made it so that another one of the same type of plant could not grow too close. So they ended up having um, a pretty uniform distribution. So, further talking about organisms and um, different patterns within them, we want to talk about a life table. So, a life table, it basically divides the organism up by age, gender, and reproductive rates. Demographers are people who study humans and their population growth and trends. And they study humans based on cohorts. Cohorts are groups of people who are born within the same year. And they also take life tables of different organisms and they turn them into what we call survivorship curves. Here's the three main types of survivorship curves, and it's basically the probability of an individual surviving to a particular age, as you can see. So humans show a type 1 curve for survivorship, and they have a really, really steady rate of survival generally until about halfway through their life, where some start to die off, and then at the end, once you reach a particular age, the majority starts to die off. Type 2, you have kind of a constant loss. There's not a particular um, trend here. It's just almost like a luck of the draw. Um, and then you have type 3, which is early loss. And type 3 being early loss is really understandable if you know how these, like clams and oysters, how they reproduce. They release large numbers of larvae into the aquatic environment that can then be eaten by a multitude of different types of organisms, filter feeders and fish, and a lot of other things. So let's look at some of the things that limit growth and influence the survivorship curves. Another way to look at um, the growth of an organism or the populations of organisms is to look at what type of growth they are undergoing. There's two main types we refer to, exponential growth and logistic growth. And you can see the formulas here, but you don't have to worry about memorizing the formulas. So exponential growth usually occurs when an area is uninhabited and a new organism inhabits that area and it has a large amount of resources available to it. A great example of an organism that will undergo exponential growth is a bacteria on a petri dish. Logistic growth, on the other hand, tends to be more rational type of growth, and it does undergo a spell where it does go kind of exponential as it enters an area, but then it slows down and then it starts to level off as it reaches carrying capacity and it reaches the time in which it's starting to interact with other organisms and other organisms are going to affect it. Let's look a little further at this. Okay, these are kind of the phases of logistic growth. So logistic growth is, like I said, a more rational type of growth. And this is going to be at the beginning of phase of exponential growth. Exponential growth is generally referred to as a J-shaped curve. Another way to look at organisms' survivorship and growth of the population is through exponential or logistic growth. Exponential growth, a great example of that is a bacteria in a petri dish. It will double its population over and over and over and over and over until it completely fills that petri dish. Exponential growth is referred to as a J-shaped curve, and there's the formula at the bottom. The logistic growth is another curve. We refer to it as the S-shaped curve, and it shows a period of exponential growth, and then it starts to reach carrying capacity. Let's take a closer look at this if we can. And here we are. This is a logistic growth curve that is reaching carrying capacity. So you have the very, very beginning of when an organism is introduced into a new environment. It's going to start to grow slowly at first, and then it is going to reach exponential growth. And when it reaches exponential growth in this type of a scenario, it is going to start like being affected by limiting agents within its environment. It could be predation, it could be just interspecies competition or interspecific competition, and it's going to level off there at the top where it's going to reach its carrying capacity. This is showing a stable equilibrium carrying capacity, but most of the time you're going to have what I call the wobble. It's where it goes like this because of the fact that it is going to interact with another organism to reach its carrying capacity, as in a predator-prey type of a relationship. So what happens when you exceed the carrying capacity? Well, take a look at this lovely graph. When you reach carrying capacity and you go beyond carrying capacity, you often end in a catastrophe. This is a situation that happened where some reindeer were introduced to an island. The reindeer had no predators on that island. They grew exponentially. They started running out of food and resources. Their waste built up so much it was toxifying the environment, and you have a crash and a decline then in the population. So let's look at some of the things that help to limit growth. So what limits the growth of a population? Competition. Competition for resources such as food, water, space, oxygen, mates. Interspecific and intraspecific competitions. Interspecific within two different populations that are going to compete for the same resources, or intraspecific within the same population as they compete for resources. All right, let's look at another pattern that we look at when we talk about communities and survivorship and such. So life histories. So in life history reports, they often refer to R-selected and K-selected species. So K-selected exists close to their carrying capacity. They tend to have really stable environments, and they have a lot more parental care, and they tend to have long lifespans. So my class came up with K for elephants because they could not decide if they wanted it to be the elephant that represented the K-selected species or the kangaroo. So therefore we have our K for elephant. We also found this really amazing picture over here. Oops, excuse me. This really amazing picture over here of a rabbit. They have large amounts of offspring, and they, sorry, let's move that out of the way for a second. And they have less parental care. So we sometimes don't see a great survivorship at all. And there we go. Okay, some other factors that influence population growth and population size have to do with limiting factors we call density dependent and density independent. So a density dependent limiting factor affects you more if you have a more dense population in compacted into a small area. In other words, you're closer together. You end up having a greater mortality rate because of disease, competition, and parasites. The other limiting factor for a population is a density independent factor, and it doesn't really matter if the population is spread out or if it is close together. It's going to affect the population in a similar way, and that is mostly natural disasters. A volcanic eruption, a hurricane, a tornado, just to name a few. So let's look at some interspecific interactions, which we had looked at previously. We have competition, predation, herbivory, symbiosis, including mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. So as you think about these different interactions between two different species, think about them as a plus, 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 minus, plus zero type of relationship. So competition. Competition is pretty much a negative negative. It's going to affect both of the organisms in a negative way. Predation, one is going to gain nutrients while the other is going to lose its life. We have a plus minus relationship. Herbivory is kind of a type of predation. It's just using plants, so we are also going to have a plus minus. Symbiosis can vary, but there's always going to be a plus. There's not going to be a minus. Excuse me. There will always be at least one plus. So not two minuses. So a symbiotic relationship, when two organisms live closely together, we're going to get mutualism in which they both are going to benefit from that. We have commensalism where one benefits and the other's not harmed or helped. And then we have parasitism. So we looked at some pictures dealing with that earlier. So let's look at competition. So this is a great example here. We have two different species of paramecium. Well, no two species can occupy the exact same niche. One species will drive the other to extinction, or resource partitioning will occur. We call this the competitive exclusion principle, and that is that no two species can occupy the same niche. Well, if you look at a situation where you have the two different species that are grown either together or separately. If you look at the diagram on the left, these guys were grown in the same environment where one completely outcompeted the other and the other one eventually died off. If you grew them separately, you can see that survivorship curve on the right. So let's look at ways to avoid direct competition. Resource partitioning. So resource partitioning is kind of an interesting thing, and I'm sure that the casual observer would not notice resource partitioning. So you have this group of warblers, and they are going to coexist in a forest together, and they're going to separate the areas of trees, and they're going to use them differently. So they're not in direct competition, actually. So let's look at some other examples. Would you consider these in direct competition with one another? Let's see if I can move this out of the way a bit. All right. So if they are in direct competition with one another, they're eating the same exact food at the same resource, this time being a body of water at the same time. And if you look carefully, they are not. They have different varieties as far as the sizes of fish which they capture. All right, another thing to avoid direct competition can be character displacement. It's kind of an interesting thought, but if you think back to Darwin's finches, we have examples of sympatric speciation and some resource partitioning. So if you have two birds on the same island and they're competing directly for food, if you have genetic variation within that, natural selection is going to favor the two extremes of natural selection so that you're going to have divergent evolution, meaning that your characteristics, or characters as they call them, are going to change from one another. And this happens when they are living on the same island, but if they're living on separate islands, you're not going to see them diverge as much because they're not in direct competition. So that's kind of an interesting type of um, resource partitioning and avoiding direct competition. So let's talk a little bit about some competition. You have a really negative interaction that we call predation that happens, and we are going to see if we can avoid being eaten. So what are some ways that we can do that? Well, if you look at the snakes, excuse me, the snake that is the eastern coral snake and the scarlet king snake, this is going to be a type of mimicry, and it's called Batesian mimicry. Batesian mimicry is shown in the top left and the top right, where they are going to take on physical characteristics of another organism so that they appear to be something that they are not. If you look at the larva in the top right corner, he's kind of cute, but he mimics the head of a snake. So a bird is not going to be as likely to pick him off. So that is mimicry. Aposematic coloration is the snake at the top center and the frog, which means it is a flashy warning color. Those are some good examples. And then you have cryptic coloration. If you look at the toad just beside me and then the octopus, these things blend in because think of cryptic coloration, like cryptic as camouflage. So let's do a little recap of some of our relationships we were referring to earlier. We have predation, and in the predation picture, you can see the bear that is harvesting the fish. You have herbivory, another type of predation, where the caterpillar is eating the leaf. You have competition, where the two bears are competing for most likely the same big, juicy salmon that they want to eat. Then you have some symbiotic relationships. We show mutualism here with the bee and the flower. It is the pollinator or the pollination vector, and then the resource which is getting pollinated. So there's a lovely mutualistic relationship there. If you look at the bottom right, you have parasitism where that poor larva has other little larvae all over it. And then in the top right corner, we have the water buffalo and the egrets. And this is meant to be a picture of commensalism, but I wanted to add a little bit to this. Commensalism is where one organism is benefited and the other is pretty much unharmed. But in the case of predation, when there are animals that are stalking the water buffalo, the egrets are actually going to be able to sometimes notify them that a predator is coming. So for a moment there, they become mutualistic relationships. All right, let's talk a little bit about species diversity and trophic structure. So species diversity is the variety of different kinds of organisms that make up a community. The components of species diversity are going to include species richness, and species richness is basically the relative Let's look at species diversity and trophic structure. Species diversity is the variety of different kinds of organisms that make up a community. It's an important factor that we look for in species diversity, species diversity is species richness, which is the number of species, and the relative abundance, which is the number of each species in the community or the percentage. So looking a little further, we have an example here where we have community diversity and species richness or evenness. We can measure this using something we call Shannon Diversity Index. Well, why do we care about the diversity within the ecosystem? Well, more diverse ecosystems have been found to withstand disturbances a lot better. They're less likely to be damaged by the introduction of an invasive species. So, change things up here and talk a little bit about trophic structure. So, trophic structure is something I know that you're all pretty familiar with. And a trophic structure is basically the part, think about it as a food chain in which energy passes through. Don't forget that energy is a one-way street. It goes from producer to consumer and from primary consumer to secondary consumer. It is not cyclical. So as you remember, we have our primary producers. That is some type of an organism that turns our energy into from the sun or some other source into a usable organic compound. Then we have our primary consumers, which eat the primary producers, secondary consumers, and so on. So we have been looking at community diversity, and let's go on to look at community structure. And this should be a review. This is looking at the different trophic levels within an ecosystem. A very basic diagram where we have our primary producer, our primary consumer, our secondary consumer, and our tertiary consumer. These are all referred to as trophic levels. And I want to remind you that energy from primary production all the way up through each trophic level is a one-way flow. Energy is not cyclical. It is a one-way flow, and only a small amount of that energy actually passes from each organism. So let's take a look at a simple food web where we have our primary producers, consumers, and so on. So one of the things that's very important to understand is look at the direction of the arrows. The arrows are indicating not what eats what, but the energy flow. So the plantain is eaten by the rabbit, meaning the energy from the plantain goes into the rabbit. So let's look at some structure of an ecosystem. And there's a couple different ways of looking at it. Now, we were just talking about food chains and food webs. And so which part is in control? Is it the primary producers or is it the apex predators? Some would argue both. So top down versus bottom up. If you look at this, this is a diagram I took from a Keystone species worksheet. And the Keystone species at the top on the left is an otter. The otter controls the sea urchin population, which is the herbivore. And therefore, you have a decent amount of kelp, which actually survives. If you add another apex predator above a keystone species, you can really alter the structure within the community. You alter the organization. So with less otters, you end up having more herbivores and a lot less kelp. Let's look at some other things that affect community structure, like disturbances. So ecological succession and intermediate disturbance hypothesis. So an intermediate disturbance hypothesis is kind of interesting. It means that small disturbances within an established ecosystem actually enhance diversity within the ecosystem. So let's look at the two types of succession. You have primary succession and secondary succession. primary succession, you are starting from solid rock. There is no soil. It is just bare rock. Well, where do you get that? Volcanic eruptions and glacial recession. And then my students said, what about a quarry that's been abandoned? And I said, around here, that's a really, really good thought, good observation. So when you have your first organisms come in to try to colonize a bare area like this, they're referred to as pioneer species. And in most situations, those are organisms called lichens. Lichen is a symbiotic relationship between an alga and a fungus, and they also help to contribute to soil formation. In secondary succession, it's generally going to be after some type of a natural disaster, but it could even be the aging of the area, because that's kind of what succession is, after something like a construction project. So let's look at some other things that influence the types of organisms and the quantity of organisms that you're going to have. And there's a couple biogeographical factors. First of all, latitude, which we've discussed in a variety of different situations in this video. And as you move away from the equator, you have less thermal energy, and you often have less species diversity as you go into colder and colder regions. Another biogeographical factor is something called the area effect, sometimes called the island effect. And it has to do with the size of the area versus the species diversity and species quantity in the area. So larger areas, it seems, have the ability to support larger numbers of more diverse species, which kind of makes sense. They have more space. So let's look quickly at some of the other factors, which we need to take a moment and look at conservation laws. So we know that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transferred from one thing to another, and mass can't be created or destroyed, only transferred and transformed into different things. So why do we care about these things? Because energy is one way, but mass is cyclical. So let's take a look. When you think of primary producers, almost everyone thinks of photosynthesis. So I have a lovely sunflower picture there for you. And that is great. But what is it really doing? Photosynthesis is taking matter, which is in an abiotic state, and chemically altering it and bringing it into a biotic state. So it is cycling matter from abiotic into biotic, which then can move through the food chain. So if you think of chemosynthetic organisms is another type of primary production where we're going from abiotic to biotic. And you can think of things like the thermoacidophiles at the bottom of the deep ocean trenches. You can think about the nitrogen-fixing bacteria inside of the nodules in the roots of legumes, which are going to take nitrogen from the air and turn it into ammonia, which is a plant nutrient. And then you can look at the oxidizing bacteria. This is in Yellowstone, this real pretty picture here. And these are another type of a chemoautotroph. So we have our two main types, our photosynthetic autotrophs or photoautotrophs, and then we have our chemical synthesizing type, which is our chemoautotrophs. So when we look at things about energy, we often look at things like the global energy budget. And we're going to stay really basic on this. So gross primary production is the amount of energy, generally referred to as light energy, converted to organic compounds. The net primary production is basically gross primary production minus cellular respiration. Another term for net primary production is biomass. And that is based on a 1 year additional growth. And then you have standing crop. It's the total and the new biomass added together. So it takes into account all primary production and removes cellular respiration and byproducts. So the last thing that we look at is net ecosystem production. Net ecosystem production is the total gross primary production minus respiration of all organisms collectively, not just producers. So let's take a moment to discuss ecosystem energy flows. So this is a nice, easy one where we can talk about primary production and how energy moves through the different phases in each simple food chain. So you have grass as a primary producer, an algae as a primary producer, and a phytoplankton as a primary producer. Don't forget about the phytoplankton. Everyone always tends to forget those, but they are excellent primary producers in aquatic ecosystems. So productivity and nutrient transfer. If you do not have certain nutrients within the environment, your ecosystem is not going to thrive. It is not going to be diverse, and your trophic structure is going to be off. So if you have a nutrient that is in a limited quantity, they refer to it as a limiting nutrient. And chemosynthetic organisms can often be helpers. So here are two examples of limiting nutrients. You have phosphorus, which is often a limiting nutrient. And if you grow plants, as you can see in these little greenhouse cells, you have one that is grown regularly and one that is grown with the mycorrhiza. So a mycorrhizal association is going to increase basically your root structure and allow the mycorrhiza can obtain the phosphorus from the soil and bring it in to the plant. So this is a type of a symbiotic relationship where the mycorrhiza help the plant to obtain phosphorus, which is limited in the area. The other limiting nutrient that we often see is actually nitrogen, which seems so weird, doesn't it, with so much nitrogen in the atmosphere? But nitrogen-fixing bacteria can take nitrogen from the air in specific types of plants, and it can turn that into ammonia, which I said previously was a nutrient for plants. So one of the other things to think a little bit about too is what if you have too much of a nutrient? What's going to happen there? You're going to have a process called eutrophication. And eutrophication happens a lot when phosphates are added into an aquatic ecosystem. The algae are going to bloom out of control, cover an entire body of water. Then they're going to run out of food, die, and then fall to the bottom to decompose, which removes the oxygen from the water, and aquatic organisms are either going to leave if they can, or they're going to die. So that's not the best situation. We want our nutrients in correct proportions, not too much, not too little. So let's talk a little bit about energy transfer and growth, and in this case, some trophic structure. So you have here a picture of a diagram of trophic efficiency. So when we are moving energy through an ecosystem, I've already said it is a one-way street. But here's one of the reasons why. With the primary producers, there is a lot of energy within those primary producers. As those producers are consumed, they're only able to transfer 5 to 30% of that energy to the organism that is next in the food chain. And then that proportion is then able to be transferred at that same rate. So if you are a exothermic organism that does not have to maintain body heat, you're going to transfer at a higher rate. But if you're endothermic and you have to maintain body heat, you use a lot of energy for that, and you're going to transfer your energy at a lower rate. So what we say to be consistent is that there is about a 10% transfer for each step in an ecological pyramid or each step in a food chain. And that's why food chains are only so long. So let's talk again about some of the needed energy and nutrients within an area. We're going to talk a little bit about biogeochemical cycles. So biogeochemical cycles often have to do with those limiting nutrients that we discussed a moment ago. Remember, matter moves within the biosphere in and out of biotic and abiotic forms, and we are sometimes caught with a limited amount of a nutrient because they get stuck in a reservoir. Reservoir, or sometimes they refer to it as a sink. It's a stage within the biogeochemical cycle that makes it a little harder for organisms to access it. Certain things can get trapped within the rock cycle for a very, very long time, or like with the nitrogen in the air, you have a lot of nitrogen, but not everything can access it as equally. I picked phosphorus and nitrogen because we've been talking about them as limiting nutrients. Well, what if we've done something and we have really, really messed up? We're really good at it, us humans. We're good at messing things up in the ecosystem. So there's two different ways that we can go about trying to clean up and improve different areas. So bioremediation is where we use organisms to clean up problems. Usually we're going to use prokaryotes. One of the best examples is using prokaryotes to clean up oil spills in the ocean. The other method that we can do is what we call bio augmentation or biological augmentation. And that's when you find that you have a limiting nutrient within an area and you basically augment or you provide that through a fertilizer or some other type of organism, like injecting some soil with some mycorrhiza to help increase the root structure and take in certain nutrients. So biological augmentation, we're adding to a situation to help improve what's already there. Bioremediation or biological remediation, we are going back to try to clean up and improve an ecosystem. So I really hope that that was helpful, and good luck on your exam.